Imagine a cold that doesn't bite, it occupies you. Not the kind of cold you escape with a jacket or a coffee, but a slow, grinding cold that seeps into bone and memory. A cold that shapes how people think, eat, and dream. For half the year, the sun barely shows itself. Darkness isn't dramatic, here it's routine. Your meals are repetitive. Potatoes, again, maybe herring, salted and preserved, if the sea was generous. Meat is rare. Luxury is suspicious. Your land is not fertile. It is stubborn. A jagged spine of granite and ice clinging to the northern edge of Europe, constantly battered by wind and water. You look south. Your neighbors, the Swedes, seem to live in a different universe. They have factories, cars, brands, confidence. They export steel and machinery. They move with the calm assurance of people who know they matter. You export fish, timber, stone, and a quiet inherited sense of being second-rate. This was Norway for most of modern history, the poor man of Scandinavia. Now snap your fingers. You are born in that same country today. The hospitals are clean. Education is guaranteed. The air is crisp. And before you've learned to walk, before you've paid a single tax, before you've contributed anything at all, you are already wealthy. On paper, you are worth more than $250,000. Not because your parents are rich, because your country is. Your nation owns more stocks, bonds, and buildings across the planet than most governments can comprehend. It owns pieces of New York, London, Tokyo. It quietly collects dividends from the global economy while you sleep. You are, quite literally, a national trust fund baby. This is not fiction. This is not propaganda. This is not luck alone. This is the story of how a nation of fishermen discovered one of the greatest treasure chests in human history and then did something almost no one else has ever managed to do. They didn't spend it. They didn't blow it on palaces, vanity projects, or imperial fantasies. They didn't let it rot their institutions from the inside out. They didn't allow it to turn their democracy into a casino. This is the story of Norway. And it begins, like most disasters narrowly avoided, with a catastrophic mistake. Let's rewind. Before oil, Norway was not a failed state. That's a myth often repeated for dramatic effect. It wasn't starving. It wasn't chaotic. But it was undeniably limited. In the 1950s, Norway was an austere society shaped by war, geography, and deep cultural restraint. The Second World War had left scars, not just physical, but psychological. Reconstruction wasn't about comfort. It was about survival, order, and discipline. If you walked into a bar in Oslo in 1955, the atmosphere wouldn't feel lively. It would feel restrained, functional, controlled. The government didn't trust excess. Citizens didn't expect abundance. Cars were rationed. Until 1960, you needed official permission just to buy one. Owning too much was seen not as success, but as moral failure. Norway's economy rested on three brutal pillars: cutting trees, breaking rock, fishing in waters that killed careless men. This was honest work, dangerous work, the kind that builds resilience but not wealth. And while Sweden industrialized and branded itself to the world, Norway remained quiet, peripheral, and self-conscious. Then came one of the great ironies of economic history. In 1958, the Geological Survey of Norway, the country's supposed experts, armed with degrees, instruments, and authorities, sent a letter to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Their conclusion: that Norway's continental shelf could safely be ignored. No oil, no gas, no sulfur, nothing worth discussing. It was, in hindsight, an almost comical misjudgment. The geological equivalent of dismissing electricity as a novelty, of rejecting the Beatles because guitar music was on the way out. At the time, however, it felt reasonable. The North Sea was not inviting. It was dark, violent, storm-ridden, a graveyard for ships and sailors, not a vault, not a blessing. Norway looked at that water and saw danger, not opportunity. But history, as always, was already moving without permission. In 1959, everything changed, just not in Norway. Down south, the Netherlands discovered the Groningen gas field, the largest natural gas deposit in Europe. The shockwaves were immediate. Energy markets reacted. Governments paid attention. And here's the thing about geology. It doesn't care about borders. Rock formations don't stop at customs checkpoints. If gas existed beneath Dutch soil and the structures extended northward, logic suggested something might be lurking beneath Norwegian waters too. This realization didn't first occur to Norway. It occurred to American oil companies. By the early 1960s, giants like Phillips Petroleum and Esso began circling. Quietly at first, then openly. They approached Norway with an offer so casual it bordered on insulting. Let us explore your continental shelf. We'll take the risk. We'll pay you a modest fee. And if we find oil, we keep it. They assumed Norway didn't know what it was sitting on. They assumed Norway was desperate. They assumed Norway could be bought cheaply. What they failed to understand was something subtle but crucial. Norwegians might have been poor, but they were not naive. And standing between Norway and the wolves was an unlikely figure, a quiet bureaucratic lawyer who understood something the oil executives didn't. The rules were unclear. International law regarding seabed ownership was, at best, ambiguous. No one had properly defined who owned what beyond territorial waters. So Norway did something bold, almost reckless. They simply declared ownership, unilaterally, a straight line down the North Sea. Everything on this side belongs to Norway. It was a legal bluff, a gamble, a gangster move disguised as paperwork. And because no one yet knew what lay beneath those waters, the world shrugged. Enjoy your wet rocks. At the time, it looked like a harmless declaration over an empty ocean. For several years, it seemed the skeptics were right. The oil companies drilled, and drilled again and again. Dry well after dry well. Millions burned. Patience eroded. By the late 1960s, optimism had collapsed. Executives were tired. Shareholders were furious. By 1969, the experiment was nearly over. The dream of Norwegian oil appeared dead before it had ever truly begun. But history has a sense of timing, and fortune has a sense of humor. Because sometimes the most expensive failure comes just moments before the greatest discovery of all. By the end of 1969, hope had thinned to almost nothing. The North Sea had become a graveyard, not just for ships, but for ambition. For nearly a decade, drilling rigs had chewed into the seabed, pulling up nothing but disappointment. Millions, no, tens of millions of dollars had been incinerated beneath freezing waves. Each failed well reinforced the same conclusion whispered in boardrooms and ministries alike. There was nothing there. The Americans were tired. Their shareholders were angrier. Exploration budgets were bleeding red. And the Norwegian oil experiment, once mocked, then cautiously tolerated, was now widely regarded as a mistake. By the summer of 1969, Phillips Petroleum, the American company leading the exploration effort, had reached its breaking point. They had drilled 37 wells. 37. In offshore drilling, each hole is a small war against physics, weather, and probability. Each one costs a fortune, and each dry result doesn't just drain money, it drains belief. Phillips wanted out. They formally approached the Norwegian government and said what everyone was already thinking: we're done. But Norway, still new to this game, did something almost accidentally brilliant. They opened the contract. Buried in the legal fine print was a clause boring, technical, bureaucratic that stated if Phillips abandoned the exploration early, they owed the Norwegian state a massive penalty fee. The executives did the math. It was cheaper to drill one final hole, one last, hopeless, symbolic hole, than to pay the penalty. Let that sink in. They weren't drilling because they believed. They weren't drilling because of data. They were drilling out of contractual spite. So they sent the rig Ocean Viking to one last location, Block 2 quarters. December in the North Sea is not merely unpleasant. It is hostile. 50-foot waves. Freezing sleet, darkness stretching 20 hours a day. Steel decks glazed with ice. Crews exhausted, angry, and dreaming only of going home for Christmas. Nobody wanted to be there. The drill bit sank. Slowly, relentlessly, and then something changed. Pressure gauges began to twitch. Mudloggers stared longer than usual at the readouts. Small anomalies appeared where there should have been nothing. On December 23, 1969, the day before Christmas Eve, they ran the test. Oil surged upward, not a trickle, not a marginal find, a monster. They had punched straight into what would become known as the Ekofisk field, one of the largest offshore oil discoveries ever recorded. Billions of barrels, high quality, accessible. A geological miracle hidden beneath water everyone had written off as cursed. A telegram was sent to Phillips' headquarters in Oklahoma. The executives thought it was a joke, a cruel prank, a drunken Christmas message. It took hours, then days for reality to sink in. Norway wasn't sitting on wet rocks. It was sitting on a geyser of money. Now imagine the moment from the Norwegian side. Christmas morning, coffee steaming, family gathered. A quiet holiday in a modest country accustomed to restraint. Then the phone rings. You are told that beneath your sea, your stormy, murderous, indifferent sea lies wealth so vast it will alter every economic assumption you've ever held. This wasn't just good news. It was dangerous news. History is littered with countries that found oil and promptly destroyed themselves. Economists have a name for it: the resource curse. Or more specifically, Dutch disease. Currencies spike. Manufacturing collapses. Politicians gorge themselves. Corruption metastasizes. Institutions rot. And when the resource runs dry, all that remains is dependency and decay. Look at Venezuela. Look at Nigeria. Look at countless petrostates where oil money hollowed out society instead of lifting it. Norway stood at the edge of that cliff in 1970. If they let American companies extract the oil freely, Norway would receive crumbs while Houston and Dallas exploded with wealth. If they rushed to nationalize without expertise, they risked catastrophic failure. They needed a plan, and they needed it immediately. Because now, the sharks were no longer casual. They were hungry. The oil companies returned, but this time without smiles. They knew what lay beneath the seabed. They knew the leverage had shifted, and they fully intended to dominate negotiations. Norway, on paper, was still weak. No drilling experience. No engineers. No industry. Just a legal claim and a lot of uncertainty. This is where the story could have turned into a familiar tragedy. Instead, something improbable happened. Norway found its most important architect not in a boardroom or a war room, but in a quiet government office. His name was Farouk Al-Qassim. He was not Norwegian by birth. He was Iraqi. A petroleum geologist trained in the Middle East, one of the few people in the country who actually understood oil, not as a symbol, but as a system. He hadn't come to Norway chasing wealth. He came for love. He married a Norwegian woman. He moved to Oslo to care for his son, who suffered from cerebral palsy. By sheer coincidence, sore fate, he walked into the Ministry of Industry just as the first oil samples were being analyzed. He asked a simple question: "Do you need a geologist?" The answer was immediate. "Yes. Sit down. Don't leave." Farouk Al-Qassim looked at the data, the contracts. The power imbalance. Dan asked a question that would define Norway's future. Do you want to be an oil nation, or a nation that happens to have oil? The difference was everything. An oil nation sells its soul for short-term gain. A nation with oil builds systems that outlast the resource. He warned them, the companies would rush. They would obscure data. They would exploit ignorance. And if Norway didn't build its own competence, its own rules, its own institutional backbone, it would be eaten alive. Together, they drafted what became known as the 10 Oil Commandments, not slogans, not ideology. Blueprint for sovereignty. Passed in 1971, these principles declared that Norway would control production, develop domestic expertise, and ensure oil wealth served the public, not corporations. It was an economic declaration of independence. But writing principles is easy. Enforcing them against the most powerful companies on earth. That's when the real fight began. Norway had oil, but it didn't yet have the ability to touch it. This is the part most people miss when they romanticize national wealth. Discovering a resource is not the same as owning it. Under the ocean, wealth is not money, it's an engineering problem wrapped in geopolitics. In 1970, Norway's situation was almost absurd. No offshore drilling technology, no trained workforce, no rigs, no industrial supply chain. No deep experience negotiating with global energy giants. All Norway really possessed was a legal claim. and a growing realization that the claim mattered more than the resource itself. This is usually where developing countries fold. The oil companies say, "We'll do the work, we'll take the risk, we'll keep most of the profit. You be grateful and accept your small cut." And most governments, desperate, intimidated, inexperienced, to accept the deal. They sign away their future in exchange for immediate cash and political applause. Norway didn't. Instead, Norway did something that made the boardrooms of New York and London choke on their coffee. They demanded partnership. They demanded knowledge transfer. They demanded control. And then they demanded something even more offensive to corporate instincts. They demanded the lion's share. In 1972, Norway created Statoil State Oil Company, later renamed Equinor. This wasn't just a business. It was a national weapon disguised as a corporation, a university, a spy agency, a training program, a future-proofing machine. Norway told foreign oil companies, "You can drill here, but you will not drill alone." If you wanted access to Norwegian waters, you needed a Norwegian partner, meaning the state would sit at the table, see the books, learn the methods, and absorb the expertise. And here's the genius part. The foreign companies didn't just have to allow Statoil to participate. They had to help pay for it. They were forced into deals where they financed part of the operation while also handing over the know-how. Imagine you own a world-class bakery. A stranger walks in and says, "I'm going to be your partner. You'll pay half my costs, and you'll teach me your recipes, your suppliers, your technique. Eventually, I'll open my own bakery and outcompete you." That's what Norway did. State-sponsored corporate espionage, fully legal, openly announced and executed with polite Scandinavian calm. And it worked. Because Norway understood a brutal truth about capitalism. Corporations will tolerate almost anything if the profit is high enough. Then came the taxes. This is where Norway stopped being clever and started being terrifying. Most countries tax corporations at 20% or 30%. Even aggressive regimes rarely push much beyond that. Norway constructed a tax framework that was essentially a financial chokehold. A special petroleum tax layered on top of normal corporate taxes. The result? A total marginal tax rate on oil profits of about 78%. 78. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a declaration. This oil belongs to the public. The companies screamed. They called it robbery. They threatened to leave. They lobbied. They tried to scare politicians with warnings of investment collapse. Norway called their bluff. Because by now, Norway had something it didn't have in the early 60s. They had proof. They knew Ekofisk was massive. They knew there was more in the basin. They knew the North Sea was not a gamble, it was a guarantee. And they understood something else. Norway was one of the safest places on earth to operate. Stable democracy, strong rule of law. No coups, no civil wars. No pipeline bombings. So Norway looked at these global giants and said, calmly, "The tax is 78%. If you don't like it, leave." And the corporations did what corporations always do when confronted with unavoidable reality. They stayed. They grumbled, but they stayed because, even after 78%, the profits were still obscene. That's how much oil was down there. That's how valuable Norway's political stability was. Norway didn't win by being aggressive. Norway won by being willing to walk away. But the North Sea wasn't a clean spreadsheet. It was steel, storm, and death. The 1970s and 80s became the Wild West of offshore drilling, except instead of dusty towns and revolvers. It was freezing water and industrial machines that could kill you instantly. And Norway paid for its wealth in blood. We have to talk about the Alexander L. Kielland disaster. In 1980, a floating accommodation platform capsized in a storm. The structure failed. The sea did what it always does when humans get arrogant. 123 men died. Norway doesn't mythologize death the way some countries do. They don't turn it into patriotic fireworks. They turned it into regulation. The tragedy shocked the nation to its core and forced a reckoning. If Norway was going to extract wealth from the sea, it would not do it with cowboy negligence. The safety culture that exists in modern offshore drilling, hard hats, redundancy systems, lifeboat protocols, Emergency drills, much of it was written in the ink of Norwegian grief. If you work on a rig anywhere today, there's a good chance some of the standards you follow exist because Norway refused to accept acceptable losses. And as safety improved, technology advanced, and Statoil learned, the money began to pile up. Not slowly, violently. By the 1990s, Norway was no longer the poor cousin. It had become the rich uncle. And that created a new problem, one far more subtle than drilling technology or corporate negotiations. Because the most dangerous moment in a nation's life is not when it is poor. It's when it suddenly becomes rich. By the early 90s, oil revenues were no longer theoretical. They were real, flowing, compounding, seductive. This is where societies usually break. New money makes people impatient. It creates entitlement. It generates political pressure. Citizens demand instant upgrades. Better hospitals, better roads, lower taxes, more benefits, more everything. And if the government delivers that spending too quickly, it triggers a slow-motion economic collapse. Inflation, currency appreciation, a dead manufacturing base. A country addicted to one resource. Economists call it Dutch disease. But it's really something older and uglier. It's the human inability to resist temptation when the vault door swings open. Norway looked at this trap and somehow didn't step into it. But to escape it, they would need something rarer than oil. They would need restraint. And in a world run by election cycles and short-term thinking, restraint is almost supernatural. That takes us to the next chapter, how Norway decided to take billions, then hide it from itself. There is a moment in every story of sudden wealth where the danger shifts. At first, the threat is external corporations, foreign powers, chaos. Later, the threat becomes internal: greed, impatience, political temptation. By the early 1990s, Norway had passed the hardest tests. It had asserted sovereignty. It had built competence. It had survived blood-soaked lessons in safety. Oil money was now pouring in at a scale that would have shattered most democracies. And that was the problem, because money doesn't just buy things, it changes behavior. The Norwegian krone began to strengthen. Wages rose. The oil sector sucked in talent like a vacuum. Why become a teacher, a carpenter, or an entrepreneur when offshore work paid multiples more? Economists watching from abroad began to murmur a familiar warning. Dutch disease. The disease works slowly, almost invisibly. A booming resource sector inflates the currency. Exports become uncompetitive. Manufacturing withers. Innovation stagnates. The economy becomes a monoculture. Norway looked at the wreckage of other nations and understood something crucial. If they spent the oil money inside Norway, they would destroy Norway. So they made a decision that still confuses outsiders. They decided not to enjoy their wealth. They decided to lock it away. In 1990, the Norwegian parliament passed legislation establishing what would later become known as the Government Pension Fund Global, though everyone simply calls it the Oil Fund. The idea was radical in its simplicity. Every krona generated from oil taxes, dividends, license fees would not be spent domestically. It would not inflate budgets. It would not fund giveaways. Instead, it would leave the country. Immediately, the money would be invested abroad in global equities, bonds, and real estate. Apple, Microsoft, Nestle, Toyota. Office towers in London. Streets in Paris. Commercial blocks in Manhattan. By exporting the money, Norway protected itself from itself. The currency stayed competitive. Fish could still be sold. Timber still had buyers. 9 oil sectors survived. And more importantly, Norway transformed a finite, volatile resource into a perpetual financial engine. Oil runs out. Markets compound. But here's the twist that almost no one remembers. For years, the fund was empty. In the early 1990s, oil revenue was still being used to pay down national debt. Politicians spoke about the fund in abstract terms: future generations. Long-term stability, but it felt distant, unreal. Then in May 1996, the first real deposit was made, about $300 million. A small number by today's standards, almost laughably small. The finance minister at the time barely made a spectacle of it. He told reporters it was for the future. No one cheered. No one panicked. No one realized they were watching history quietly change direction. That deposit was a snowball. and it had just begun rolling downhill. Fast forward to today. The fund owns roughly 1.5% of all publicly listed companies on Earth. Let that number breathe. 1.5% of everything. If you walk through New York, Tokyo, London, Norway owns pieces of what you see. Office buildings, retail chains, infrastructure, digital platforms. It is one of the largest investors in human civilization, and that creates a problem no spreadsheet can solve. How do you tell citizens to wait when the vault is overflowing? How do you explain underfunded hospitals, aging rail lines, or slow infrastructure projects while sitting on more than $1 trillion? This is where Norway introduced its most brutal rule. In 2001, the government formalized what is known as the fiscal rule of policy, so strict it borders on self-inflicted suffering. The state is allowed to spend only the real return on the fund, not the principal, not the oil money itself. Historically, this was estimated at 4%. Later revised down to 3% to be conservative. This rule is the financial equivalent of a chastity belt. Touch the principal and the machine dies. Spend only the returns, and it can last forever. Let's put numbers to it. At roughly $1.6 trillion, a 3% return generates about $48 billion per year. That money funds roughly 20% of Norway's national budget. 1 out of every 5 kroner spent on schools, hospitals, roads, and police comes not from taxes and not from selling oil today, but from decisions made decades ago. It is money from the past paying for the present. And obeying this rule requires something most societies lack: trust. In many countries, a politician suggesting restraint would be laughed out of office. Voters demand visible benefits now. Campaigns are fueled by promises to spend. In Norway, a politician who suggests breaking the rule is treated like a reckless child. They aren't praised for generosity. They're accused of stealing from their grandchildren. To understand how rare this is, look at Alberta, Canada. Similar oil, similar timing, similar democratic institutions. Alberta created a heritage fund in the 1970s, but without strict spending rules. Politicians dipped into it when times got tough, used it to lower taxes, funded short-term popularity. Today, Alberta's fund is worth roughly $16 billion. Norway's is worth 100 times more. The difference wasn't luck. It was discipline. But discipline has a cost. You walk through Oslo and everything works, but it's not dazzling. Roads have potholes, trains run late, hospital waiting lists exist, and visitors ask the obvious question, why not fix it? You have the money. The Norwegian answer never changes. If we fix it with oil money today, our children will pay tomorrow. This is delayed gratification at a national scale. But even this restraint carries a shadow, because wealth, no matter how carefully managed, creates contradictions. And Norway's contradiction is impossible to ignore. They are green, they are clean, they are electric. Norway has the highest per capita electric vehicle adoption on Earth. In some years, over 80% of new cars sold are fully electric. Cities are quiet, air is clean, hydropower lights, homes, and yet, the money that funds this green paradise comes from exporting massive quantities of oil and gas. Norway is a dealer who doesn't use their own product. They sell fossil fuels to Germany, the UK, and the rest of Europe, then drive home in Teslas and lecture the world on sustainability. It is hypocrisy. It is also reality. And Norway is painfully aware of it, which leads to one final evolution of their strategy, one that turns their wealth into something stranger than money. Influence, wealth, does something subtle before it does anything obvious. Before it builds towers or buys influence, it rearranges morality. By the late 2000s, Norway was no longer just rich. It was structurally insulated. The oil fund had grown so large that its daily market fluctuations could equal the annual budgets of smaller nations. And with that scale came a new, deeply uncomfortable question. What kind of power do you want to have? Norway could have chosen silence, passive ownership, pure profit. Instead, it chose something stranger and far riskier. It chose judgment. The oil fund didn't just invest, it evaluated. An independent ethics council, philosophers, lawyers, economists, was tasked with answering a question no hedge fund ever asks. Should we own this at all? Not will it make money, but is this acceptable? Companies involved in nuclear weapons. Banned. Tobacco producers. Excluded. Severe environmental damage. Out. Systematic human rights abuses. Gone. Entire corporations were blacklisted, not because they were unprofitable, but because they were morally inconvenient. When Norway sells, markets notice. It's not just a capital loss, it's the signal. Being expelled from the Norwegian fund is like being quietly removed from an elite club. Other investors start asking uncomfortable questions. Reputations wobble. Share prices react. This is how Norway converts oil, one of the dirtiest commodities in history, into moral leverage. It sells fossil fuels, then uses the profits to pressure global capitalism into behaving better. Is it hypocrisy? Absolutely. Is it effective? Uncomfortably so. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, this paradox sharpened into something almost unbearable. As Russian gas vanished from Europe, Norway ramped up production. Pipelines filled. Revenues exploded. Some estimates suggest Norway earned more in that single year than in several previous years combined. Critics called it war profiteering. Some politicians demanded Norway share the windfall. Norway declined, politely. The justification was cold, but logical. If Europe didn't buy Norwegian gas, it would buy dirtier fuel from less stable regimes. Better democratic gas than authoritarian gas. A brutal trade-off. A real one. Norway didn't pretend to be pure. It chose to be strategic, but strategy has consequences. Because once a nation becomes this wealthy, this insulated, the danger is no longer corruption. The danger is softness. There's an old saying that refuses to die because it keeps proving itself true. Hard times create strong people. Strong people create good times. Good times create weak people. Weak people create hard times. Norway is deep in the good times phase, and the cracks are starting to show. Here's a statistic that makes economists uncomfortable. Norway has one of the highest sickness absence rates in the developed world. Not because the climate is harsher, Sweden and Finland share it. Not because healthcare is worse, it's better, but because the system removes consequence. In Norway, workers receive 100% of their salary from day one of sick leave for up to a year. No penalty, no pressure, no stigma. Over time, this changes behavior. There is even a slang verb, to NAVM'd, after the welfare agency. It means living off state benefits. Teenagers joke about it. I'll just nav for a while. This terrifies the older generation, the ones who remember herring, rationing, and fear. They see comfort eroding hunger. Security dulling ambition. The oil sector, with its astronomical wages, worsens the imbalance. Talent drains away from teaching, healthcare, entrepreneurship. Why risk building something when stability pays better? Sweden poorer in oil produced Spotify, IKEA, Minecraft. Norway produced Statoil, and mostly more Statoil. The fear is not collapse. The fear is atrophy. That when oil finally fades in, Norway may discover that wealth preserved too well can preserve weakness too. And yet, this is not ignorance. Norway debates this openly, relentlessly. They tweak incentives, adjust policies, argue about work ethic and responsibility. These are not the problems of a failing state. They are the problems of a civilization trying to outgrow its own success. Which brings us to the final question. What is Norway really rich in? Most lottery winners go broke. Not because the money disappears, but because they were never built to carry it. They buy too fast, spend too loud, trust too easily. And eventually, the money exposes what was always missing. Norway won the greatest lottery in modern economic history. Oil beneath frozen water, quality, accessible, timed perfectly with global demand. But Norway didn't behave like a winner. It behaved like a paranoid accountant. It made 3 decisions that changed everything. First, sovereignty. They had the courage to say no to corporations stronger than themselves. To insist ownership mattered more than speed. Second, discipline. They refused to consume the future for the present. They built rules that made temptation politically toxic. Third, and most important, trust. The people trusted the state not to steal. The state trusted institutions over personalities. Experts were allowed to manage without spectacle. That trust is the real natural resource. Oil was just the catalyst. In most countries, a promise to save the money for later would spark riots. In Norway, it sparked patience. The lesson of Norway is not geological, it is cultural. A nation is not rich because of what it extracts, but because of what it resists. Norway understands something most civilizations forget. The wealth doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the past that endured, the present that manages, and the future that hasn't arrived yet. They are not owners. They are guardians. And as long as they remember that, as long as they resist softness, greed, and entitlement, they will remain kings of the North. But if they forget, well, history is always waiting.